Mr. KRASKA, we are very happy to welcome you to our symposium on the Strait control during wartime. As I say, just a few minutes before we achieved to solve our problem, our informatic problem, just to present you, your internationally acclaimed American scholar and a distinguished professor of public international maritime law, specializing in the international law of the sea and the law of maritime operations and naval warfare, of course. You're the current chairman and professor of international maritime law at Stockton Center, if I know well, and also you are often coming to the United States Naval War College. You're also visiting professor of law and lecturer on world organization at Harvard Law School, if I well remember. So you are in charge to introduce us to this main problem of the Strait control during wartime, and without any without any delay, I give you the word, please.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for the hosts and sponsors, the French government and NOMS and the other institutions that are supporting this conference. I deeply regret that I'm not there in person because the entire agenda looks fantastic. I have read many of the authors who are speaking, and I just wish I could be there. I had prior commitments, and so I wasn't able to. So what I'll talk about is the legal regime and the confluence of international law and international strategy of straits during armed conflict. And that is a relatively simple equation. And so I'm going to spend most of my time on what might be termed the gray zone, or situations that are less certain. And so with that, I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides that will go through some case studies. Let me know if this...
it's clear for us. You can, yeah, perfect.
Does that look okay?
Okay.
Okay. So straits in times of war or gray zone crisis, if you look at what we're focused on, straits in war, and we understand that these straits comprise the international choke points that are essential for not just economic prosperity, but military security. If you think about American grand strategy, the United States is essentially an isolated island away from the centers of power of Europe or Asia, and therefore it requires access to the open oceans in order to maintain the global security architecture. And it especially relies on these critical straits. There are some here. There's actually about 110 strategic straits throughout the world. I've identified here just some of the more prominent ones. And these straits connect the United States to markets as well as allies and partners in both Europe as well as East Asia. Now, during armed conflict, straits used for international navigation, generally under Article 37, fall within the 12-mile territorial sea of a coastal state and therefore comprise territorial seas. And if those coastal states are neutral states, then naval operations in the territorial sea are prohibited. That is, the territorial sea of a neutral state is inviolable. So if two states are at war, those two states can conduct naval warfare anywhere in the oceans except the territorial sea of neutral states. Now what this means is that those belligerent states, those two states, may utilize straits in the regime of transit passage to expeditionally go from one part of the high seas or exclusive economic zone to another part of the high seas or exclusive economic zone, but they may not prosecute or conduct belligerent activities within the strait, which is also the territorial sea. So what this means is that they can use the straits, but they may not do so in a manner that threatens the peace, good order, or security of the coastal state. And that means that they cannot launch attacks from the strait, and they also may not do other belligerent activities, such as the belligerent right of visit and search to determine the enemy character of a neutral ship. They could not do visit and search, visit, board, search, and seizure inside the strait. So this formula is relatively simple, and it's also set out in two restatements on the law of naval warfare. The first you may be familiar with is the San Remo Manual, which is a good product that was printed in 1994. The second was printed in 2023, and that is the Newport Manual on the law of naval warfare. Mainly these manuals do overlap quite a bit, and with regard to straits, I believe they are in agreement, although I will say the Newport Manual, which I was involved in, I think has greater adherence to state practice, and it also is updated. It includes issues such as autonomous vessels, but they're both great resources. So with that, let's look at some of the harder questions of what about if it's something that's quite ambiguous? Maybe it is a war, maybe it's not. The rules for warfare are quite simple, as I've just gone over, but let's unpack these case studies in the remaining time that we have, because there's some court decisions as well as scholarship that would suggest that the case is not always clear what the navigational regime is and what the rights of the coastal state is and the user states are in straits. So the very first case of the International Court of Justice was the Corfu Channel case, and it's often regarded as upholding the right of navigation through straits used for international navigation. This basically stands for the proposition that states could exercise innocent passage through straits. Now recall that I just said under Article 37 and Part 3 of the Law of the Sea Convention that straits are generally subject to a regime of transit passage. This transit passage regime is a product of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, whereas the ICJ case in the Corfu Channel from 1949 focuses on innocent passage. Nonetheless, it stands for the proposition that all vessels of all flags may utilize the straits both in peacetime and in war. Now, the wartime aspect of this case is often forgotten in the textbooks. You have to remember that this was immediately after World War II. The facts arose in 1946, and the Soviet Union was destabilizing this area of the world, and Albania was aligned with the Soviet bloc. So Albania was impeding British warships, which were transiting through the strait. The Royal Navy had swept the strait of mines, and yet the Albanians continued to lay them, and on October 22nd, one of the ships was preceded, there was a squadron of British ships, and one of them struck a mine, and then later on that day, about an hour and a half later, another one struck a mine. So the British highly suspected that these mines were laid by Albania because the Royal Navy was supporting Greece in its struggle against communist insurgents. There were a number of other incidents preceding this: gunfire from the Albanian side, the mine strikes that I mentioned. During the Samaras that was struck, the vessel named Sunrise, 44 were killed and 42 injured. And then the vessel had to be towed out of the strait. So the the Albanians, the squadron was going from the south to the north. The Albanians actually brought the case. And Albania was held to be, the question the British posed was Albania responsible for the damage to the warship and the deaths of the 44 killed sailors? And the ICJ, which has 16 justices, ruled that Albania was, quote, responsible. It was responsible because it had a duty to ensure freedom of maritime communication through the strait. But what's interesting is that the court also ruled that even though the United Kingdom was entitled to innocent passage for freedom of communication, or what we would say today, freedom of navigation, that the Royal Navy or the British were not in innocent passage. They did not have a right to intervene by demining the strait. And so this is somewhat interesting because the ICJ gives, on the one hand, the right of innocent passage, but restricts or denies the right to assure that it's safe through demining. And this is a bit of a paradox where the ICJ kind of divides so that everyone's a winner, or neither side gets what it wants. But I might suggest that the case law, the resulting case law, is not particularly helpful for those responsible users of the oceans that want to maintain safe access. Now we'll come back to this case when we look at the oil platforms case in the Strait of Hormuz, because the ICJ does something similar in that case. But we'll go on to the Taiwan Strait. There are a number of these Taiwan Strait crises. They often involve these offshore islands, Quemoy and Matsu. More recently, you may have seen that China is suspected of having cut submarine cables to those islands, which lie just offshore of mainland China. And of course, this is a crisis that's always complicated by the legal status of Taiwan. And so that's a sort of an existential legal issue that I won't get into. But just to say that Taiwan is a strait that's some 90 miles wide, and therefore it is a geographic strait, but it's not a juridical strait, meaning it is a strait from a geographic standpoint, but it's not a legal strait because it does not encompass territorial seas, because territorial seas only extend out to 12 nautical miles, and therefore there is a high seas corridor between the East China Sea in the north and the South China Sea in the bottom. And so the navigational regime is quite clear, both in times of peace and in times of armed conflict, so long as foreign flagged forces or commercial vessels stay beyond 12 nautical miles. Now, that doesn't ameliorate the political crisis, which we know is sort of gathering or growing and has been for about 70 years. Now, I mentioned that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea does recognize innocent passage in regular or normal territorial seas, but it has this regime of transit passage. Transit passage applies when an area of the territorial sea constitutes a strait by connecting one part of the high seas or EEZ to another part of the high seas or EEZ. And that transit passage regime was created, or is a function of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was adopted in 1982. The Indonesian Straits crisis led up to the creation of the Law of the Sea, and this was, from the U.S. perspective, the number one issue for U.S. interests. The right of transit passage through straits used for international navigation. There were a couple of crises between the British in Indonesia and the Americans in Indonesia with regard to usage of the Sunda Strait and the Lombok Strait in the 1960s. where Indonesia was claiming the right to restrict transit of warships. And you can see here on the left, the Sunda Strait, it's only 16 nautical miles wide, and the Lombok Strait down near Bali is only 12 nautical miles wide. Indonesia claimed that they had a right to receive notification prior to transiting the straits. The United States, United Kingdom, Australia had normally been providing notification as a courtesy, but they realized that under customary law, of course, if you continue to do a practice, then the other side can suggest that it has become a legal obligation. And so in this instance, there was a British aircraft carrier force. At this time, the British sent 3 aircraft carriers through the strait, and those aircraft carriers were on their way to suppress the Huk Rebellion in Malaysia, in British Malaya. And they went through the strait, and the Indonesians protested their transit. And so Indonesia purported to close the strait when the Royal Navy wanted to go back out into the Indian Ocean on their return to the United Kingdom. Well, a compromise was reached because rather than using the Sunda Strait, the British used the Lombok Strait that the Indonesians hadn't officially closed. And so kind of the crisis were averted, but you can see that there was already a strong disagreement between Indonesia and these maritime powers. In fact, the United States sent the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Command sent this message to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on 10 October 2244 Zulu time in 1964, in which the United States said that it should begin to exercise freedom of navigation more frequently through straits, out of fear that, out of fear that the coastal states would begin to close off these straits, and also that the United States should stop providing notice as it transited through the straits, because then the coastal state might come to rely on that, or to argue that it had become customary international law. So this was the #1 issue for the United States going into the negotiations for the Law of the Sea Convention. Now, what effect has it had? Well, it's still with us today on a daily basis. You can see, for example, the Strait of Hormuz on the left before the Law of the Sea Convention, where a 3 nautical mile territorial sea was widely accepted. And after the Law of the Sea Convention, because of the expansion of the territorial sea to 12 miles, then the entire strait was closed off by territorial seas. Now, this has continued to be an irritant, one of many, between the United States and Iran, because Iran suggests that if you're not a member, if you're not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, then you are not entitled to transit passage. You're only restricted to innocent passage. This was brought up by Iran during the last days of the Law of the Sea negotiations. The United States, of course, is not a party to the Law of the Sea, but it regards the treaty as reflective of customary international law, and customary law is just as binding as treaty law, and therefore the United States adheres to the convention and claims the right of transit passage. Another interesting wrinkle that we're going to see more and more of is unmanned or autonomous vessels. The United States currently operates hundreds of these sail drone vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, and occasionally Iran has been known to pick them up. This raises several issues which we could explore in some further detail in a different venue. But the first is, are these craft sovereign immune vessels? And therefore, on the bottom picture where you see here where Iran has seized this vessel, this sail drone, is that a violation of U.S. sovereign immunity? The U.S. view, which I think is widely regarded, is that whether it is a sovereign immune warship or it's simply state property, like let's say a satellite that falls out of the space, out of the sky and then lands in the ocean, that satellite is not necessarily a sovereign immune warship, but it's nonetheless the sovereign property of the state the government that launched it. And so that has been a bit of a back and forth diplomatic issue between the United States and Iran. Now, another issue with regard to Straits, of course, is the Kerch Strait incident in 2018, and this involves a choice of law question. What I mean is that in this incident, you had a number of Ukrainian warships that were transiting south from the Sea of Azov through the Kerch Strait, and they were impeded by Russian forces, both Russian border forces as well as elements of the Russian armed forces, including helicopters. And they were shot at. And of course, the individuals on these ships were captured, they were detained for some amount of time, and this has now become one of the 3 international cases that Ukraine has filed against the Russian Federation. The reason it's a choice of law is because notice that this is 2018. This is before the 2022, let's say, re-invasion of Korea, if you count that in 2014, Russian forces had occupied Crimea in violation of the UN Charter. And so most people would view this as a question of freedom of navigation, of Ukrainian warships being entitled to transit through the Strait of Azov, which both Russia and Ukraine claim as internal waters. But another perspective is that this was a lawful attack by Russian armed forces against Ukrainian armed forces in an armed conflict. Under Geneva Convention, Common Article 2, an armed conflict is any sort of use of force between 2 states that is greater than some minimum threshold. And so if you say that the occupation of Crimea exceeded that threshold, then Russia and Ukraine were already at war in 2018, and then this attack would have been a lawful attack by Russian armed forces against Ukrainian armed forces. Now remember to keep distinct that jus in bello, the law within the armed conflict, is one thing, and that doesn't have anything to do with whether Russia illegally occupied Crimea in the first place. All it has to do is, all the jus in bello issue is concerning is whether the Russian military members that are executing this mission according to their lawful orders, if they injure or kill someone, are they liable for murder as common criminals, or were they simply pursuing lawful means of prosecuting the war in which you're entitled to kill the enemy? So if you look at it from a jus in bello standpoint, you might say that this was actually a lawful attack within an unlawful armed conflict. And Russia would bear the responsibility for the unlawfulness, not the soldier on the battlefield. This case was brought before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the International Tribunal, in my view, made an error, and I wrote about this in European Journal of International Law online. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea said that this was a law enforcement activity on the part of Russia, and therefore the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea asserted jurisdiction over the case. Now, Russia claimed, look, this was manifestly a dispute over military activities. And why did Russia want to argue that? Russia lost this jurisdictional case, and the case on the merits is still going on at the Permanent Court of Arbitration. But the reason Russia argued that is because both Russia and Ukraine have exercised optional exceptions under Article 298 of the Law of the Sea Convention that says that their warships may not be subject to jurisdiction under the Law of the Sea Convention. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea was created by the Law of the Sea Convention, and therefore Russia is arguing that the It-Los Tribunal in Hamburg, Germany did not have jurisdiction over the case. The jurisdictional phase has already been decided upon, and It-Los rejected Russia's argument. Now, I actually wrote a small piece and said that actually It-Los did not get this correct, that they do not actually have jurisdiction over this because this is a military activity, not a law enforcement activity, and you have to think about whether states that are sovereign in the international system want to subject their military activities to this type of review. Now, both Russia and Ukraine have exercised their right under Article 298, optional exception, to remove from any tribunal military activities in the law of the sea. And they are not alone in having done so. Indeed, France and other major countries, all the permanent five on the Security Council, and the U.S. will do so if or when we join the convention. We already have our declaration drafted. In fact, our declaration has been drafted for 30 years. In November, it will be 30 years. So the United States is going to join China, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom in removing from jurisdiction any kind of military activity. So my discomfort with the It-Los case is not that I'm trying to side with Russia necessarily, but rather it's that what happens in a future case when It-Los wants to assert jurisdiction over a French or a Danish or a U.S. warship, and those countries say, wait a minute, these are warships involved in the military activity, and It-Los says, sorry, but we don't see it that way. We see it as a law enforcement activity, or an intelligence activity, or a navigational activity, or some other label they want to put on it. But nonetheless, this is the holding. At its core, the dispute was about differing interpretations of the regime of passage, not military matters. And so that was the decision. Now let's go on to the last two, and then I'll be glad to close. Another strait that is prominent in armed conflict with regard to Russia-Ukraine are the Turkish Straits. Now, the Turkish Straits have a unique status in the Law of the Sea Convention because they constitute one of these long straits that are subject to long-standing international treaties or agreements. The Montreux Convention. Under Article 35 of the Law of the Sea Convention, it says that most states are indeed subject to transit passage. They connect one part of the high seas or EEZ to another part of the high seas or the EEZ. But there are a number of straits that are subject to separate treaties. The Montreux Convention, the Baltic Straits, the Strait of Magellan. These are subject to long-standing international agreements that have a slightly different legal regime. In this case, Turkey is in the driver's seat, because if Turkey is a neutral state in an armed conflict, such as it is with Russia-Ukraine, then all ships of all nations can transit through there, but there's only a limitation on belligerence. And so you may recall that in the beginning of the conflict in early 2022, there were some Russian warships that were outside of the Black Sea, and they were allowed by Turkey to enter into the Black Sea to return to their home base. And therefore, Ukrainian and Russian warships may not go back and forth, they simply can just return to their base in the Black Sea. And then for a while there was some drama about whether Turkey would close the straits to other warships, like what about NATO warships, for example. The United States and other countries have operated in the Black Sea. And Turkey did exercise that right. It said that if it feels that it might be threatened by the presence of foreign warships, it can close the straits. And it doesn't owe anybody any further explanation. And that's what Turkey did in order to de-escalate the situation, and all the countries have observed Turkey's authority to do so under the Montreux Convention. And then the last one is the most current crisis, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. And in this case, somewhat interesting because you have a non-state actor that is exercising the force that previously only states could do. The Houthi forces, rebel forces in Yemen, have successfully launched numerous ballistic missiles targeting ships going through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb into the Gulf of Aden. And so you have a question of whether there is national or collective self-defense in the face of these attacks, not just anti-ship ballistic missile attacks, but also drone attacks, mine strikes, and anti-ship cruise missiles. So a variety of precision, long-range precision munitions and old-school munitions that have been targeting commercial ships and warships. I think my view would be after 9/11, there certainly is the attacks of 9/11 in 2001. There certainly is no question that states have a right of individual self-defense against non-state actors, and also there is a right of collective self-defense. Now, the only sort of wrinkle to this would be that purists in international humanitarian law would say, yes, there's a right of collective self-defense if the state that is being attacked requests assistance. This is underscored by the paramilitary activities case with the United States and Nicaragua, that the states that are being attacked have to request assistance. I would have to admit that in this case, with US and UK and other countries' warships protecting commercial shipping in this area, that it's not clear whether that legal requirement has been fulfilled, but nonetheless, nobody really seems to be complaining when they are defended against these attacks ongoing. And so with that, I think given the interest of time, I've talked quite a long time, I'm just going to give a reference here to the 1990s, Houthis and the Blowfish, and then stop there and take questions or move on to the next item in the agenda. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, James, for this this very interesting intervention. Thank you for this very contemporary approach to the problem, which reminds us of its importance in very current conflicts, where in fact the interpretation of terms by each actor remains also fundamental. I will let the assistants to ask one or two questions maximum, because we are a little bit late. Is there any question?
You're also welcome to email me. I'm glad to follow up on the conversation.
Okay. Fine, thank you very much. On a l'adresse email de...
Je crois qu'il y avait une question.
Il y a une question? Oui.
Thank you for your speech. My question, I never well understood, can you hear me?
Yes.
I never well understood why the Yemeni authorities authorities a few years ago didn't never look to military occupy the Perim Island, which is a Yemeni territory. And that was my question. It was empty and manned, only a few fishermen. But from a military point of view, they never looked to occupy this island. Do you have any idea about it?
I'm sorry, I don't. And it's very intriguing, and I agree with you. It's a really compelling question. Seems like it would be an obvious move to do, and very much needed.
Another question, yes?
Sir, I want your opinion about the debate between states in concern of the unique situation. The majority of states are agreed to allow that states have the right to defend. That state have the right to defend their ship in favor of the customary law. But they are debating about the extent of their right to allow state to hit directly the Yemen territory, and we saw the British and the Americans hit the Yemen territory and pleading their rights. About Article 51 of the UN Charter. So what are your opinion between the debate of these two rights, one on the ground of the customary law and one on the ground of the Article 51 of the UN Charter, even if that article just recognize the right of self-defense based on customary law?
Thank you for the question. If I understand correctly, my thoughts would be that, of course, Article 51 reflects customary international law, as you, I think, indicate, and that it is an inherent right, both individual and collective self-defense. And customary international law would apply the Caroline Doctrine or the Caroline case and I think key is the element of imminency, that self-defense is permitted when an attack is imminent, and of course imminent involves some temporal or time judgment over which I think reasonable people could differ. Also, I would say that the right of self-defense extends more than just in the moment, but rather it extends to preventing future likely attacks. This is, debatable among humanitarian law scholars, but it seems to me that if you, some would say you don't have a right of self-defense before the attack, and then they would say you don't have the right of self-defense after the attack. You only have this narrow sort of during the actual attack, and to me, that just sort of like the Corfu Channel case, it kind of shifts the risks onto the states that are maintaining stability and order, and kind of that view sort of favors states that can kind of create chaos and then take advantage of the lawfare, if you will. I'm not sure if that's responsive.
Okay, thank you very much, James, for your presence with us today.